The wedding photos show a man smiling, but if you knew what to look for in his eyes, you'd see something else entirely. A flicker of resignation masked as joy, a subtle dimming of the self that no one at the ceremony notices because everyone is watching the bride. This isn't cynicism, it's psychology, and it's happening in millions of marriages right now, invisible to the people living inside them. What if the greatest threat to a man's psychological wholeness isn't his career, his father wound, or even his unprocessed trauma, but the very institution he's been taught will complete him? What if marriage, as it's currently constructed in the collective unconscious, contains an inherent exploitation that nobody wants to name because naming it would shatter one of our culture's most sacred illusions? Welcome to Deep Psyche Lab. I'm glad you're here because what we're about to explore together requires courage. This isn't an attack on marriage itself, nor is it a diatribe against women or partnership. This is an examination of psychological structures, ancient, invisible, and deeply embedded in how we've organized intimate life. If you're new here, this channel explores the hidden architecture of the psyche using depth psychology, Jungian concepts, and the kind of inquiry that doesn't look away from uncomfortable truths. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the conversations we have here don't happen anywhere else. Today we're investigating something that lives in the gap between what marriage promises and what it psychologically delivers, specifically for men. And before you react to that statement, before your defenses rise or your political allegiances kick in, I want you to consider this. Exploitation doesn't require malicious intent. It simply requires an imbalanced exchange that operates below conscious awareness. It requires one party giving more of their psychological essence than they receive, without realizing they're doing it, often while believing they're doing what love demands. Carl Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what he didn't emphasize enough is that not all transformations are growth. Some are diminishments, some are slow erasures. And in the particular alchemy of modern marriage, men often undergo a transformation that nobody prepared them for, a kind of voluntary self-abandonment that masquerades as maturity. Let's start with something most people never question: the psychological contract of marriage. Not the legal contract, not the vows spoken in front of witnesses, but the unspoken, unconscious agreement that gets activated the moment a man says, "I do." This contract wasn't written by him. It wasn't negotiated. It exists in the collective unconscious, passed down through generations, reinforced by every romantic comedy, every cultural narrative, every well-meaning piece of advice from married men who've learned to perform contentment. The psychological contract says this: your individual desires are now secondary. Your professional ambitions must be filtered through family consideration. Your friendships will atrophy because maintaining them feels selfish. Your hobbies become guy time that requires permission or negotiation. Your financial decisions are no longer yours alone, even if you're the primary earner. Your time, your space, your energy, your future, all of these now belong to a collective entity called we. But in practice, the we often means what she wants plus what the children need plus what's left over for you. This isn't misogyny. This is pattern recognition, and the pattern reveals something uncomfortable. Men are socialized to experience self-erasure as love, and to call their own disappearance growth or maturity or being a good husband. Jung spoke of the anima, the feminine aspect within a man's psyche, the soul image that he projects onto women. When a man falls in love, he's often falling in love with his own anima projection. He sees in his partner qualities of his own undeveloped inner world, and the relationship feels complete because she seems to carry what he lacks. But here's where the exploitation begins. In marriage, men are often expected to continue serving that projection indefinitely, to continue seeing their wives as the carriers of soul and meaning, while simultaneously being denied access to their own inner feminine. The result is a man who looks outside himself for permission to feel, to intuit, to access the softer aspects of being human. And that external dependency becomes a point of control. This control isn't necessarily exercised maliciously. It's structural. When a man externalizes his anima into his wife, he hands over his emotional literacy, his capacity for introspection, his connection to the unconscious. He becomes psychologically dependent in a way that women, who've been culturally encouraged to develop their inner lives, often are not. And this dependency, this outsourcing of the soul, creates an imbalance that can be exploited even without anyone intending to exploit it. Think about the common dynamic. Who manages the emotional temperature of the household? Who remembers the birthdays? Plans the social calendar? Decides when it's time to talk about feelings? In most marriages, even marriages between progressive people who consciously reject traditional gender roles, these functions default to the woman. And men accept this arrangement, not because they're incapable, but because they've been taught that emotional management is feminine labor. What they don't realize is that by outsourcing this labor, they've also outsourced their autonomy. They've become children in the realm of feeling, perpetually needing their partner's interpretation of emotional reality. The exploitation here is subtle but profound. A man who cannot read his own emotional landscape, who requires his wife to tell him what he's feeling, or when something is wrong, is a man who can be controlled through emotional withholding. And before you think I'm describing a weak man, understand this. We're describing the average man, the normal man, the man who did everything right according to cultural programming and found himself in a psychological cage he didn't know he was building. Let's go deeper. One of the most pernicious forms of exploitation in marriage is the conversion of the provider role from a choice into an identity. When a man marries, he doesn't just take on financial responsibility, he becomes that responsibility. His worth, his value, his right to respect within the marriage becomes fused with his capacity to provide. This isn't just about money. It's about the psychological weight of being the one who cannot fail, cannot falter, cannot admit exhaustion without threatening the entire structure. Jung called this identification with the persona, mistaking the mask you wear in the world for who you actually are. In marriage, men are often encouraged, even required, to identify completely with the provider persona. The man who wants to quit his corporate job to become a teacher? Who wants to take a sabbatical to find meaning? Who wants to be supported while he sorts out his existential crisis? That man is often met with anxiety, resistance, or direct pressure from his partner, because his provider persona is load-bearing. The family structure, the lifestyle, the future plans. All of it rests on him continuing to perform this role regardless of the cost to his inner life. And what's the cost? The cost is the slow starvation of the self. The cost is decades lived in service to external demands while the internal world withers. The cost is reaching 50 years old and realizing you've been living someone else's life, that you've been so busy providing that you forgot to become. Jung warned about this. He said that the greatest tragedy is not death, but a life unlived. Yet marriage, as it's culturally structured, often demands exactly the sacrifice from men, and calls it love. Now we need to talk about something that makes people uncomfortable: the weaponization of emotional labor. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years about emotional labor, usually framed as invisible work that women do to maintain relationships and households. And that's true. It's real. But what's rarely discussed is how the recognition of emotional labor has become a tool for creating perpetual debt within marriages. The logic works like this. She performs emotional labor, which is exhausting and undervalued. Therefore, he owes her. His contributions, financial, physical, temporal, are reframed as merely expected, while her contributions are framed as exceptional sacrifices that require constant acknowledgement and reciprocity. This creates what Jung might call a power complex, a psychological structure where one person holds permanent moral high ground. In this dynamic, the man can never do enough, contribute enough, or be enough, because the metric keeps shifting. Every load of laundry she does becomes evidence of his inadequacy. Every school form she fills out becomes proof that he's not pulling his weight. Never mind that he worked 60 hours that week, that he's quietly carrying financial stress, that he's suppressing his own needs to maintain stability. The narrative of emotional labor exploitation flows in only one direction, and it positions him as perpetual debtor in a ledger he didn't know existed. The exploitation here isn't in the labor itself. Both partners contribute labor of different kinds. The exploitation is in the psychological framework that treats only certain kinds of labor as sacrifice, while treating others as mere obligation. A man who works a job he hates to fund a lifestyle his family expects? That's just being responsible. A woman who manages the family calendar? That's heroic emotional labor requiring effusive gratitude. Can you see the imbalance? Can you see how this framework extracts from men while obscuring the extraction? Let's examine the marriage market itself from a Jungian perspective, because the very process of getting married reveals exploitation at the structural level. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, those deep inherited patterns of human behavior and expectation. In the marriage market, the collective unconscious has encoded a deeply lopsided exchange model. Men are expected to prove their worth through demonstrable resources, career stability, earning potential, home ownership, the ability to fund a wedding and honeymoon, the capacity to signal provider credibility. Women participate in this market too, obviously, but the weight of financial proof falls disproportionately on men. This isn't controversial. It's observable reality. Dating apps reveal it. Wedding industry economics reveal it. Divorce statistics reveal it. Men are screened for providership in ways women simply aren't. And this screening process continues throughout the marriage. A man who loses his job experiences not just financial stress, but identity crisis and marriage instability, because his role was never just husband, it was economic anchor. This creates a psychological vulnerability that can be exploited, often unconsciously. If your value in the marriage is tied to your utility, then your humanity becomes conditional. You're not loved for being, you're tolerated for doing. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we can't accept and therefore project onto others. In the context of marriage exploitation, the shadow operates in fascinating ways. Society projects onto men the shadow qualities of aggression, selfishness, and emotional unavailability. These projections create a pre-existing narrative that the man in any marriage is probably failing somehow, probably not doing enough, probably harboring some moral deficit. This shadow projection means that when conflicts arise, there's already a cultural assumption about who's at fault. The man defending his need for space, for autonomy, for boundaries, he's being selfish. He's not committed. He's reverting to bachelor behavior. His partner expressing the exact same needs, she's practicing self-care. She's maintaining her identity. She's refusing to lose herself. Can you see how the same behavior gets interpreted through completely different psychological frames? This is shadow projection in action, and it creates an environment where exploitation can flourish, because the exploited party has no legitimate language for their experience. If you're a man feeling drained by your marriage, feeling like you've disappeared into role and obligation, the cultural narrative tells you that's what growing up looks like. It tells you to be grateful. It tells you that your discomfort is immaturity, that your desire for something different is selfishness, that your exhaustion is weakness. This brings us to one of Jung's most important concepts, individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are, of integrating all the parts of yourself, of differentiating from collective expectations to discover your authentic being. It's the central task of the second half of life. But here's the problem. Marriage, as culturally constructed, often actively opposes individuation for men. The man who begins questioning his life, examining his choices, wanting to explore different possibilities, that man is threatening the marriage. His wife didn't sign up for a husband who wants to change, who questions, who needs something different than what he needed a decade ago. She signed up for stability, predictability, the continuation of a mutually understood script. So the man faces a choice. Continue the process of becoming himself, which may destabilize the marriage, or abandon individuation to preserve the relationship. And here's where the exploitation becomes existential. To choose the relationship over the self is to choose a kind of psychological death. It's to remain a fragment, a persona, a role player. It's to reach the end of life having never met yourself. Jung considered this the greatest tragedy available to human beings. Yet it's what marriage often demands from men, explicitly or implicitly. Don't grow in ways that inconvenience us. Don't change in ways that require adaptation. Don't become at the expense of stability. Women face pressures in marriage too, absolutely. But the specific pressure on men to remain the unchanging oak tree, the provider, the stable presence, is particularly toxic to individuation. Women are culturally permitted transformation. They can reinvent themselves, return to school, change careers, discover new passions, and this is celebrated as growth. Men doing the same are often seen as having a midlife crisis, as being selfish, as abandoning their responsibilities. The double standard is stark, and it creates a psychological prison where men must choose between being a good husband and becoming a whole person. Let's talk about conflict resolution in marriage, because this is where subtle exploitation often becomes visible. In most marriages, there's an unspoken rule about how conflicts must be resolved. They must be processed through emotional discussion until consensus or capitulation occurs. This mode of resolution heavily favors people, often women, who are comfortable in the realm of extended emotional processing. Men who may prefer to withdraw, think things through alone, and return with a solution are told this is stonewalling, this is emotional avoidance, this is an unhealthy behavior that must be corrected. Notice what's happening here. One mode of processing, verbal, immediate, emotionally expressive, is deemed healthy and necessary. Another mode, internal, solitary, solution-focused, is pathologized. The man who needs space to process is told he's damaging the relationship, that his need for withdrawal is actually a form of punishment, that healthy marriages require constant emotional availability, so he learns to override his own psychological needs and force himself into a mode of engagement that depletes him. This is exploitation masquerading as emotional intelligence. The result is a dynamic where conflicts always unfold on one person's terms, where one person's emotional needs structure how problems must be solved. The man who says, "I need time to think about this," is met with, "No, we need to talk about this now." His boundary is overridden in the name of healthy communication. Over time, he learns that his internal rhythms don't matter, that his processing style is wrong, that to be a good husband means to be available in the ways she needs, even if that availability drains him. This is how exploitation embeds itself in the micro-interactions of daily life. Through the steady message that his way of being is insufficient and must be corrected, Jung understood that the psyche has its own ecology, its own needs and rhythms. When those are chronically violated, when a person is forced to operate outside their psychological nature, symptoms emerge. Depression, anxiety, resentment, emotional numbing. These aren't personal failures. They're the psyche's protest against intolerable conditions. Many men in marriages are experiencing these symptoms and attributing them to work stress, aging, or personal inadequacy, when actually they're responding to a marriage structure that requires constant self-violation. Now we need to discuss something particularly painful: the exploitation of male disposability. At a deep archetypal level, cultures have always treated men as more disposable than women. This isn't a value judgment. It's an evolutionary and historical reality. Men went to war, worked the dangerous jobs, sacrificed their bodies and lives for the collective. This disposability carries into marriage in subtle ways. The man's physical health, his emotional well-being, his happiness. These are often treated as less urgent than the corresponding needs of his wife and children. Consider how often you've heard someone say about a husband and father, "He's fine, he's tough, he can handle it." Consider how rarely anyone checks on the inner life of the married man, how his struggles are met with "provide better" rather than "you deserve support too." This disposability means that a man can be objectively suffering in his marriage, working himself into exhaustion, suppressing his needs, living in quiet desperation, and nobody notices or cares because his function is to absorb difficulty, not to require attention. The exploitation here is civilizational and personal at once. Wives often unconsciously participate in this dynamic, assuming their husbands are infinitely resilient, that whatever burden is added, he'll carry it. And men participate too, afraid to admit struggle because admitting it would make them failures. So the exploitation continues, invisible, normalized, treated as just how things are. Jung spoke about the need for reciprocal transformation in relationships. True partnership means both people are changed by each other, both are challenged to grow, both must sacrifice and integrate. But in many modern marriages, the transformation is asymmetrical. The man transforms himself to fit the relationship requirements. He becomes more emotionally expressive, more domestically involved, more attuned to needs outside his own. These are valuable developments, but notice what's rarely demanded in return. Women are rarely asked to become more comfortable with male processing styles, more appreciative of traditionally masculine contributions, more willing to support their husband's individuation even when it's inconvenient. The transformation flows one direction. The man must become more like what the relationship needs. which usually means more emotionally available in feminine-coded ways, more focused on connection, more willing to privilege relationship over self. He's rarely met halfway. She's rarely expected to stretch into his way of being, to understand his psychological structure on its own terms, rather than demanding he reconstruct himself according to her emotional architecture. This one-directional transformation is exploitation. It's asking one person to do all the psychological labor of change while the other remains comfortably positioned in their natural mode, now validated and supported by therapeutic culture that positions emotional expressiveness as health and other styles as pathology. Let's examine the exploitation that happens through the weaponization of therapy language. Modern marriages are now saturated with psychological terminology, and this is a double-edged development. On one hand, it's good that people have language for emotional experiences. On the other hand, this language is often deployed as a form of control. A husband who wants alone time is avoiding intimacy. One who doesn't want to endlessly discuss feelings is emotionally unavailable. One who prioritizes his work is workaholic and avoidant. One who expresses frustration is being toxic. These therapeutic labels, removed from actual therapeutic context, become weapons in marital conflict. They position the husband as psychologically defective and the wife as psychologically sophisticated. They shift every disagreement from a negotiation between different but equal needs into a diagnosis of the husband's inadequacy. This is extraordinarily exploitative because it removes the man's ability to simply have different needs or preferences. Everything becomes evidence of his brokenness. Everything requires his correction. Nothing he wants or needs is accepted at face value. It must be interpreted through a psychological framework that finds him lacking. Jung warned about psychologism, the reduction of complex human experiences to psychological labels. In marriage, psychologism functions as a form of gaslighting. The man who feels drained by constant emotional demands is told he has an intimacy disorder. The man who wants more sex is told he's not connecting emotionally first. The man who feels the relationship is unbalanced is told he's not seeing all the invisible labor his wife does. His direct experience is perpetually invalidated through psychological reinterpretation until he doubts his own perceptions entirely. This is how exploitation operates at the level of epistemology. By making it impossible for the exploited person to trust their own knowing, we need to talk about the exploitation inherent in modern expectations around fatherhood. Men are now expected to be emotionally present, highly involved fathers while simultaneously maintaining or increasing their provider responsibilities. There's been no corresponding reduction in financial expectations. Wives still screen for earning potential, still expect a certain lifestyle, still divorce men who can't maintain financial stability. But there's been a massive increase in domestic and emotional expectations. The modern father is supposed to split childcare, be present for emotional needs, attend every event, help with homework, manage bedtime routines, all while working full-time and often being the primary earner. This is mathematically impossible without total self-abandonment. There aren't enough hours in the day, there isn't enough energy in the body, so men are set up to fail, perpetually falling short of contradictory expectations, perpetually being told they're not doing enough in one domain or another. The exploitation is in the impossibility of the demand. It's in expecting someone to be both a 1950s provider and a 21st century egalitarian partner, with no acknowledgement that these roles were never designed to coexist in one person. The man who tries to meet these expectations doesn't become virtuous. He becomes exhausted, resentful, and hollow. He's exploited not by malice, but by cultural evolution that added to men's burdens without removing any, that demanded more emotional labor without reducing expectations around financial labor. And when he fails, when he can't perfectly balance all these contradictions, he's blamed for his inadequacy rather than the system being questioned. Jung's concept of the self, the totality of who you are, beyond roles and personas, is particularly relevant here. Marriage, as currently structured, often requires men to identify completely with their roles: provider, protector, problem solver, emotional supporter. But these are masks, personas, not the self. The man who has only these functions has abandoned his own center. He's living from the outside in, shaped entirely by external demands, with no connection to his own depths. This is spiritual death masquerading as responsibility. And here's the cruelest irony. The woman in such a marriage often isn't happy either, because a man who's abandoned his self isn't attractive or interesting. He's useful but not vital. He provides but doesn't inspire. She may not consciously want him to individuate, but unconsciously she's attracted to a man with inner life, with purpose beyond her, with a center that can't be moved by her moods or needs. The exploitation makes him less of what made him attractive in the first place. Let's talk about divorce, because the exploitation of men in marriage becomes starkest when marriages end. Despite decades of progress toward legal equality, family courts still operate on assumptions rooted in past eras, that children primarily need mothers, that men are economic agents rather than parents, that a man's relationship with his children can be reduced to weekend visits and child support checks. The man who invested decades in his marriage, who sacrificed career opportunities to spend time with family, who is an involved father, often finds himself reduced to a visitor in his children's lives and an ATM for his ex-wife. This isn't every divorce, but it's common enough to constitute a pattern. And the possibility of this outcome creates what amounts to a hostage situation within the marriage. The man knows that if things fall apart, he stands to lose his daily relationship with his children, his home, and potentially a substantial portion of his future earnings. This knowledge, conscious or not, affects every calculation he makes in the marriage. Every time he considers standing up for himself, setting a boundary, saying no, the specter of catastrophic loss hovers in the background. This is exploitation through structural threat. Even in marriages without overt problems, the asymmetry of divorce risk creates a power dynamic where the man has more to lose and therefore less freedom to advocate for himself. He must be more careful, more accommodating, more willing to accept unsatisfactory conditions, because the alternative is too devastating to contemplate. Jung spoke of the Jungian, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites that creates something transcendent. This is what marriage could be. This is the potential that makes people believe in the institution despite its problems. The conjunctio happens when two people meet as equals, when both bring their wholeness, when the relationship serves both people's individuation rather than requiring its sacrifice. But this kind of marriage is rare because it requires both parties to consciously resist the cultural programming that creates exploitation. It requires the woman to see and value her husband's contributions without filtering them through grievance frameworks. It requires her to support his needs even when they're inconvenient, to meet him in his psychological structure rather than demanding he always come to hers. It requires the man to maintain his center, to refuse self-abandonment even when that refusal creates conflict, to continue his individuation regardless of whether it's comfortable for the relationship. It requires both people to periodically ask, is this marriage serving both of us? Or has it become a structure where one person's flourishing depends on the other's diminishment? Most people never ask that question. They accept the marriage they have, explain away the imbalances, tell themselves it's normal, convince themselves that the quiet desperation they feel is just part of being an adult. But Jung's entire psychology is about waking up, about bringing consciousness to what's been unconscious, about refusing to live in patterns we didn't choose. If you're a man listening to this and recognizing yourself in these descriptions, understand this: you're not crazy. You're not weak. You're not failing at marriage. You might be succeeding at something that's destroying you. You might be excellent at a role that requires your disappearance. The question isn't whether you can be a better husband. You've probably already optimized that beyond what's healthy. The question is whether you can be a more whole person and whether your marriage has space for that wholeness. This probably requires a difficult conversation. It requires telling your partner that something needs to change, that the current balance isn't sustainable, that you've been giving from an empty well and something has to shift. This conversation will likely be uncomfortable. It may be met with defensiveness, with accusations of selfishness, with the deployment of all the psychological language we discussed earlier. But the alternative is continuing to disappear, continuing to live outside yourself, continuing to mistake self-erasure for love.